Have you ever poured your entire life into building a home, only to wake up one day and realize you were just another piece of the furniture? For 40 years, I was the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the silent partner in a perfect life. But perfection is a lie. And when the lie shatters, you have two choices: get swept away with the broken pieces, or pick up the sharpest one and fight back. My story is about what happens when a ghost from the past gives you the weapon you need for a war you never knew you were born to win. If you believe in the power of a woman who has nothing left to lose, then follow my story. Like and share this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and make sure you press that notification bell so you don't miss a single moment of the storm that's coming. The crystal champagne flutes chimed like a chorus of tiny, fragile bells. 40 years. The sound was supposed to represent 40 years of marriage, of partnership, of a life built together. From my seat at the head of the long, mahogany table, I could see it all reflected in the polished surface: the glittering chandeliers, the soft glow of candles, the faces of 50 of Northwood's most influential people, all smiling, all drinking my husband's expensive champagne. My champagne, technically, but no one ever thought of it that way. It was always Richard's house, Richard's party, Richard's success. I was just the curator of it all, the silent, smiling woman who made sure the catering was flawless, and the flower arrangements were breathtaking. My son Jacob stood near the fireplace, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of his wife, Sarah. She was laughing at something Richard had just said, her head tilted at that specific angle she used when she wanted to convey adoration. It was a practiced angle. I knew because I had seen her practicing it in the reflection of the hall mirror once. They were a perfect unit, the three of them. The powerful patriarch, the devoted son, and the ambitious daughter-in-law, all gleaming under the warm lights of the empire Richard had built. An empire built on concrete and steel, on shrewd deals, and, as I would soon learn, on buried secrets. I took a slow sip of my wine. A deep, blood-red Merlot. It felt appropriate. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. I saw Olivia Sterling, 62 years old, elegantly dressed in a silk gown the color of cream, her silver hair styled perfectly, her posture impeccable. She looked calm, she looked serene, but inside a low tectonic hum had been vibrating for years. It wasn't unhappiness, not exactly. It was a waiting. A stillness before a storm I couldn't name. Richard tapped his glass with a spoon. The gentle chiming silenced the room instantly. He had that effect on people. His presence filled any space he occupied. He was handsome, even at 65, with a full head of silver hair that he kept perfectly coiffed, and a smile that could disarm his fiercest competitor. Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. 40 years, with my Olivia." He glanced at me, and the smile he offered was for the audience, not for me. I'd learned to tell the difference 30 years ago. She has been the rock, the foundation upon which this family, this life, was built. Polite applause. Jacob and Sarah clapped the loudest. I just smiled. It was a simple movement of the lips, a muscular habit. I felt the weight of every one of those 40 years settling on my shoulders. 40 years of packing his suitcases. 40 years of canceling my own plans for his last-minute business dinners. 40 years of listening to him talk about his triumphs, while my own passions, my own thoughts, withered on the vine like unwatered gardenias. "But life," Richard continued, his voice taking on a new, almost philosophical tone, "is about growth. It's about evolution. It's about not being afraid to embrace the future." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not malice, just an unnerving certainty. He was enjoying this. This was a performance. He turned slightly and gestured toward a table near the window. A young woman stood up. She was beautiful, of course. All of Richard's acquisitions were top of the line. She couldn't have been more than 30. She had long, dark hair and the kind of unshakable confidence that comes from never having known a day of true hardship. She walked toward him, her movements fluid and self-assured. "I want you all to meet someone," Richard said, his arm wrapping around her waist. This is Amelia. She is a remarkable woman, full of life, of energy. He looked from her face to the crowd, his smile widening. Amelia is my future. A collective intake of breath sucked the air out of the room. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. I saw the frozen smiles on our guests' faces, the way their eyes darted from Richard to the woman to me. I saw Jacob's face go pale, his jaw tightening. Sarah's eyes, however, were sharp, calculating. She was already working the angles, recalibrating. Richard and I, Amelia began, her voice soft but clear, have a very special connection. We do, Richard boomed, cutting her off gently. He was always the one in control of the narrative. And because of that, Olivia and I will be ending our marriage. We've had a good run, but it's time for a new chapter, for both of us. He looked directly at me then. For the first time all night, he was truly speaking to me, though his words were for everyone. I want to make this as smooth and painless as possible. There's no need for ugliness. I am, of course, prepared to be very generous. I've already found a lovely suite for you at the Northwood Pines Luxury Retirement Community. You'll be very comfortable. A generous allowance, of course. Everything taken care of. A luxury retirement community. An allowance. He was talking about me as if I were a faithful old dog he was putting out to a comfortable pasture. He wasn't just ending our marriage, he was ending me. Erasing me from the picture and replacing me with a newer, shinier model. The hum inside me stopped. The tectonic plates of my life didn't just shift, they fractured. And in that fracture, something cold and clear rose to the surface. I didn't look at Jacob or Sarah. I didn't look at the shocked faces of our friends. I didn't look at Amelia, the bright, shiny future. I held my husband's gaze. I saw the confidence there, the absolute certainty that I would do what I had always done. Be quiet, be graceful, and fade into the background. He was expecting tears. A scene, perhaps. A dignified, heartbroken retreat. I did none of those things. I slowly, deliberately picked up my wine glass. I took a small sip of the dark red Merlot, letting the taste linger on my tongue. I set the glass down with a soft, definitive click. The sound seemed to echo in the crushing silence. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. And then I spoke. My voice not a whisper, not a shout, but a blade. Richard, I said, meet my lawyer. You'll be hearing from her. The party didn't so much end as it shattered. People evaporated. One moment, the room was full of stunned faces and half-empty glasses. The next, it was just the echo of car doors slamming and tires crunching on the gravel driveway. They fled as if a contagion had been released into the air, their hurried goodbyes catching in their throats. No one met my eye. I was no longer the hostess. I was a disaster site they were desperate to avoid. When the last car pulled away, the silence that fell was heavier than any sound. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of everything that had just happened. The house, my home for 4 decades, suddenly felt like a stage after the play has ended. The props left askew, the magic gone. I stood there, by the great marble fireplace, tracing the cool, smooth stone with my fingertips. I was waiting. I knew it wouldn't be long. Mother, Jacob's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. I turned. He and Sarah stood at the entrance to the grand living room, their coats still on, as if they were afraid to commit to staying. But they weren't leaving. Not yet. What in the hell was that? He demanded. His face was blotchy with anger, his eyes wide with a panic that had nothing to do with my well-being. That, I replied, my voice even, was a statement. A statement? Sarah scoffed, stepping forward. Her designer handbag was clutched in her hand like a weapon. That was a declaration of war. Olivia, do you have any idea what you've just done? She used my first name. She only did that when she was trying to put me in my place, to remind me that she saw us as peers, competitors. I believe I do, I said calmly. No, you don't, Jacob snapped. Dad's offer was, it was for the best, for the family, a quiet settlement, everyone moves on. You could have had a comfortable life. But no, you had to be dramatic. You had to embarrass everyone. Embarrass you, you mean, I corrected softly. Sarah let out a sharp, exasperated breath. This isn't about you anymore. This is about the family's reputation, our social standing, Jacob's position at the company, a messy, public divorce. It could ruin everything. All the investors, the partners, they value stability. Do you want to be the woman who brings all of that crashing down because your feelings got hurt? My feelings got hurt. The phrase was so small, so dismissive, for the chasm that had opened in my life. It was like calling a tsunami a bit of damp weather. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, whose fevers I had cooled, whose nightmares I had soothed. I searched his face for a shred of concern for me, his mother. I found none. I saw only the reflection of his father's ambition and a desperate clawing fear of losing his place in the line of succession. Just then, Richard walked back into the room. He had taken Amelia home, I presumed. He had shed his party jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He looked tired, but also energized, like a general after a successful first strike. "Jacob, Sarah, that's enough," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, false note of paternal authority. He was positioning himself as the calm center of the storm I had supposedly created. "Let me talk to your mother." They backed away, but they lingered in the doorway, a captive audience to my dressing down. Richard walked over to the bar and poured himself a whiskey. He didn't offer me one. "Olivia," he began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I'm disappointed. I truly am. I thought you had more class than that. Meet my lawyer." It was theatrical, unbecoming. I remained silent. I had learned long ago that Richard didn't have conversations. He delivered monologues. The best thing to do was let him play his part. "I've given you 40 years of a life most women can only dream of," he said, his voice low and reasonable. It was his gaslighting voice, the one he used when he was about to convince me that black was white. "This house, the travel, the status. You haven't had to worry about a single thing. I handled everything. Perhaps that was the problem. You had too much time on your hands. You lost touch with the real world." He took a sip of whiskey. "And let's be honest, shall we? You let yourself go. Years ago. You stopped trying. You stopped being interested in my life, my work. You just existed. A marriage needs passion, Olivia. It needs a spark. You let the spark die." He was rewriting history, painting his infidelity as a direct consequence of my failure. My failure to remain young, my failure to be endlessly fascinating, my failure to worship at his altar with sufficient fervor. He was blaming the portrait for fading while ignoring the fact that it had been left in a dark, airless room for decades. "Amelia," he said her name softly. "She gets it. She's vibrant. She challenges me. She's part of my world." I looked past him at my son and daughter-in-law. They were nodding in agreement with Richard's assessment of my failings. They were accepting this narrative because it was convenient. It absolved them of any responsibility. It kept the lines of power and, more importantly, inheritance clear. If I was the problem, then Richard's actions were justified, and their alliance with him was just common sense. It was in that moment, standing there in the wreckage of my party, that the last veil lifted. This wasn't a shock. It wasn't a sudden, brutal revelation. It was the final, undeniable confirmation of a truth I had been swallowing my entire adult life. I was not a partner. I was not a rock. I was an accessory, a beautiful, well-maintained piece of property that had, over time, lost its value. I was a status symbol that was being traded in for a newer model. My purpose was to be beautiful, to be quiet, and to reflect his glory. And now that I was no longer serving that purpose to his satisfaction, I was being decommissioned. I felt no rage. Not yet. The anger was a deep, frozen lake I hadn't reached the bottom of. What I felt was a profound, chilling clarity. I saw the three of them, bound together by greed and a desperate need for the power Richard wielded. I was the only thing standing in the way of their perfect, seamless future, and they were looking at me as if I were a problem to be solved, a nuisance to be managed. I said nothing. My silence was a vacuum into which they poured all their ugliness, all their justifications. And I let them. I watched. I listened. I observed their true natures, laid bare and squirming in the harsh light of betrayal. My silence wasn't surrender. It was reconnaissance. The next morning, the house was oppressively quiet. Richard had slept in one of the guest rooms, a courtesy that felt more like a territorial claim than a kindness. I woke up in our bed. My bed now, I supposed. And the space beside me was a cold, empty expanse. For years, that emptiness had been a familiar companion on the many nights he was away on business. But this morning it felt different. It felt permanent. I went through the motions of my morning routine. Coffee. The dark, bitter brew was a small, solid comfort in a world that had become fluid and uncertain. The sun streamed through the kitchen's floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. This house, which had once felt like my kingdom, now felt like a gilded cage. Every beautiful object, every polished surface, seemed to mock me with the memory of the lie it represented. I sat at the marble island with my tablet, a habit ingrained over years. I'd check the news, glance at the markets for Richard, and maybe order some specialty groceries. I decided to do something for myself, a small act of defiance. I'd book a flight, just a short trip away, maybe to the coast, to a quiet hotel where I could breathe air that wasn't thick with betrayal. I opened the airline's website, found a flight to Monterey, and went to the payment page. I typed in the number of my primary credit card, the one with the impossibly high limit that Richard always boasted about. I hit confirm. A small red box appeared on the screen. Payment declined. Please contact your card issuer. Strange. A technical glitch, perhaps. I tried again. Same result. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I opened another browser tab and pulled up the website for my second card, my personal one, supposedly. The one I used for lunches with the few friends I had left, for gifts, for the illusion of financial independence. I tried to buy a simple, inexpensive book from an online store. Declined. The knot in my stomach turned to ice. My hands felt cold. With a growing sense of dread, I navigated to our joint bank account's online portal. I typed in the familiar username and password. Access denied. Your login credentials are not recognized. I stared at the screen. The letters were stark, impersonal, final. He'd done it. Sometime between his monologue last night and the sun rising this morning, Richard had acted. Swiftly. Silently. He hadn't just announced his intention to leave me, he had begun the systematic process of erasing me. He had cut the financial arteries, no credit, no cash. He had locked me out. He was strangling me, making it impossible for me to even buy a plane ticket to escape. He wanted me trapped here, in this beautiful prison, with no resources, no power. He wanted me utterly dependent, utterly helpless, so that when his lawyers came with their paltry settlement offer, I would be too broken and desperate to refuse. This was his first move in the war I had declared, and it was a brutal one. The house suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. I felt the weight of his control in a way I never had before. It wasn't just emotional dominance. It was a physical, practical cage. Panic began to rise, hot and sharp in my throat. I could call Jacob, but I knew what he would say. See, Mother, this is what happens when you don't cooperate. I had no one, and then I remembered. It was a memory from years ago, maybe 10. A small, unsettling incident I had pushed to the back of my mind. Richard had been on a trip to Asia. There was a typhoon in the region, flights were grounded, and I couldn't reach him for 2 days. His phone went straight to voicemail. His office had no information. For 48 hours, I had been completely cut off, adrift in a sea of worry. The feeling of powerlessness had been terrifying. When he finally called, full of dismissive apologies about poor reception, I had vowed to never feel that way again. The next day, I had gone to a nondescript electronics store in a neighboring town. I paid cash for the cheapest prepaid phone they had, a simple plastic burner phone, and a top-up card. I brought it home and hid it. It was my secret. A tiny anchor in a life where I owned nothing, not even my own security. I'd tucked it inside a hollowed-out copy of War and Peace on a dusty top shelf in my personal study. I hadn't touched it in a decade. My heart hammering against my ribs, I walked purposefully to the study. The room was my sanctuary, the one space Richard rarely entered, filled with my books on art history and gardening. I ran my hand along the spines of the leather-bound classics. There it was. War and Peace. My hands trembled slightly as I took it down. It felt heavier than it should. Inside, nestled in the carved-out pages, was the cheap black plastic phone. I pressed the power button, praying there was still a flicker of life in the battery. The screen lit up. A green bar showed a quarter charge. Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I sat down, the phone feeling foreign in my hand. This was it, my one lifeline. I scrolled through the empty contact list. I had only ever programmed one number into it, just in case. I thought about who to call, not my friends. They were Richard's friends, really. Their sympathy would be laced with pity, and their loyalty would be, at best, divided. Not my son. He had already chosen his side. My thumb hovered over the single entry in the phone book. Chloe, my granddaughter, a law student at Georgetown. She was sharp, witty, and possessed a healthy cynicism about her parents' social climbing world. Our relationship was one of quiet understanding. We didn't talk often, but when we did, she looked at me, really looked at me, in a way no one else in the family did. She saw past the perfect hostess. She'd once told me during a holiday visit that I had sad eyes but a spine of steel. The comment had startled me. It was the truest thing anyone had said to me in 20 years. She was my only call, my only hope. I pressed the button. The phone rang, a tinny, unfamiliar sound in the quiet opulence of the room. It rang once, twice. Hello? Her voice was clear, questioning. I took a breath. Chloe, I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. It's Grandma Olivia. There was a pause. Grandma, is that you? You sound strange. What number is this? It's a long story, dear, I said. Listen carefully. I need your help. Something has happened. The day bled into a long, tense night. Richard never came home. A single curt text was all I received. Staying in the city, we'll have the lawyers arrange for me to collect my things. He was already building his new life, while I was left to haunt the old one. Jacob and Sarah sent a barrage of messages, a mixture of threats and pleas. Dad is furious. Just call his lawyer and accept the terms. Don't destroy this family. The word family had become a weapon they used to beat me into submission. I ignored them all. I was waiting. After my call with Chloe, a fragile sense of purpose had taken root in the barren ground of my despair. She hadn't been emotional. She had been practical. Sharp. Don't talk to them, Grandma. Don't sign anything. Don't react. Just observe and wait for my call. She was thinking like a lawyer. She was thinking strategically. It was more than I could have hoped for. As darkness fell, the house grew colder. The familiar shadows seemed to lengthen, to twist into unfamiliar shapes. I felt like an intruder in my own home. I wandered from room to room, touching the furniture, the paintings, the objects I had spent a lifetime curating. They felt like artifacts from another woman's life. In our bedroom, in my bedroom, I stood by the window, looking out at the manicured lawns bathed in moonlight. My side of the king-sized bed was closer to the window. For years I had been aware of a particular spot in the old hardwood floor, a single board that had a slight give to it, a faint creak when you stepped on it just right. Richard, a heavy sleeper who always took the side by the door, never noticed. I discovered it one night, unable to sleep, pacing the room. A small imperfection in a house that was otherwise relentlessly perfect. A secret that belonged only to me. A thought, a memory, surfaced from the deep. A ghost from a past I had deliberately buried. A cold dread, mingled with a new rising fury, propelled me into action. I knelt down on the soft rug. My knees protested, but I ignored the ache. Using my fingernails, I worked at the edge of the loose floorboard. It was stubborn, sealed with years of polish and dust. I went to my dressing table and came back with a silver nail file, its tip thin and strong. I wedged it into the seam and pried. The board groaned in protest, and then, with a soft crack, it lifted. Beneath it was a small, dark hollow. The air that rose from it smelled of dust and old paper and secrets. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. Reaching into the cavity, my fingers brushed against cool, worn leather. I pulled it out. It was a diary, a small, handsome volume, bound in dark green leather, its cover bare except for the embossed initials, A.V., Arthur Vance. The diary trembled in my hands. It wasn't my memory playing tricks on me. It was real. The ghost was real. A flashback, vivid and unwelcome, flooded my mind. 20 years ago, 2005. Richard's company, Vance Sterling Development, had just closed the biggest deal of its career, a massive waterfront redevelopment that would make them both legends. Richard was euphoric, invincible. 2 weeks later, Arthur Vance, his 50-50 partner, was found dead in his home office. The official report said suicide, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The note he left spoke of overwhelming pressure and personal demons. Richard had been publicly devastated. He gave a moving eulogy. He set up a generous fund for Arthur's widow and young daughter. And then he absorbed Arthur's half of the company, becoming its sole, undisputed master. A month after the funeral, I was helping Richard pack up his things from their old, shared office. He was moving to a grander suite of his own. I was alone, sorting through files, when a box of old blueprints slipped from a high shelf. Tucked behind it, fallen into the gap between the cabinet and the wall, was this diary. I saw the initials, and my blood ran cold. That night, after Richard was asleep, I read it. I only read a few pages, scattered entries from the final weeks of Arthur's life. I was too terrified to read more. The words weren't about personal demons. They were about something far more sinister. R is pushing for the buyout. The price is an insult. He says I have no choice. He knows about the overseas account. How could he know? He threatened to expose it. He said it would ruin me, but he'd frame it to protect himself. He called it insurance. He has a darkness in him I never saw. He smiled today while telling me I was a liability he had to manage. It wasn't a business discussion. It was a threat. The final papers are on my desk. It feels like signing my own death warrant. He has me in a cage. I had slammed the book shut, my body shaking with a terror so profound it felt like I was going to be sick. My husband, the man I slept next to, was not the man I knew. But what could I do? I had a young son, Jacob. I had a perfect life, a gilded cage I was too afraid to leave. To acknowledge the truth of that diary would be to set fire to my entire world. So I chose willful ignorance. I chose to be blind. I pried up the floorboard that night, and I buried Arthur Vance's ghost, hoping it would never surface again. But it had. And now, holding it 20 years later, my hands were not trembling with fear. They were trembling with a cold, electrifying rage. This wasn't just a diary. This was a testament. The story of another man Richard had gaslit, cornered, and destroyed to get what he wanted. He called Arthur a liability. Last night, he had looked at me with the exact same cold calculation. He had offered me a comfortable cage in a retirement home, just as he had offered Arthur a cage of financial ruin. Richard hadn't changed. He had only gotten better at hiding the darkness. I opened the diary again. Under the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window, the cramped, desperate handwriting seemed to pulse with a life of its own. This book was no longer a source of terror. It was not a secret to be buried. It was evidence. It was a weapon. It was the only power I had in a world that had been stripped away from me. Richard had locked my bank accounts, but he had forgotten about this one, the one I had held in secret for 2 decades. The ghost of Arthur Vance was finally free, and he was on my side. Chloe's research felt like a key forged in a digital fire. She'd sent me a single name, a law firm, and a short encrypted message. Evelyn Reed, the best. She eats men like Dad for breakfast. Don't tell her everything at first. See if she's worthy. Worthy. The word resonated with the weight of the diary resting in the bottom of my handbag. The drive into the city was a disorienting collage of glass and steel, a world that had continued to spin while I had remained perfectly still. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, navigating streets I once knew intimately, now rendered alien by 40 years of comfortable isolation. Evelyn Reed's office was not what I expected. There was no mahogany or leather-bound books meant to intimidate. It was a space of clean lines, white walls, and a single, startlingly vibrant abstract painting that seemed to hum with energy. It was a room that made no apologies, just like I presumed the woman who occupied it. Evelyn Reed was sharp, not just in her tailored suit, but in her gaze. It was a gaze that didn't offer pity, it assessed. She listened without interruption as I laid out the sanitized version of my story. The story of a 65-year-old woman discarded for a younger model after 4 decades of service. The dutiful wife, the hostess, the silent partner in a man's ascent. I spoke of the anniversary party, Richard's cruel public announcement, the financial strangulation. I painted a portrait of a victim, because that is what they expected me to be. That is what Richard believed I was. I watched her face for any sign of condescension, any flicker of boredom. I saw none. She just absorbed it all, her fingers steepled under her chin. The only sound was the soft hum of the city, 10 floors below. The diary in my bag felt like a hot coal. It was the truth, the real weapon. But Chloe was right. A weapon is useless in the hands of an untrustworthy ally. First, I needed to know if Evelyn Reed fought for victims or if she fought to win. When I finished, the silence stretched, taut, and deliberate. I didn't fidget. I didn't weep. I simply met her gaze and waited. I had done a lifetime of waiting. I was good at it. He cut off your credit cards and joint accounts, she finally said. Her voice a low, precise instrument. It wasn't a question. The day after the party, I confirmed. And your son, Jacob, and his wife, Sarah, they're siding with him. They believe it's in the family's best interest for me to accept a quiet settlement, to protect the estate, their inheritance. I let the cold truth of it hang in the air. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. So Richard offers you crumbs from the table you helped set. Your children tell you to eat them and be grateful, and you're supposed to fade into a tastefully decorated, financially dependent twilight. That's the story. That's the story they're writing, I said. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. But you're not here for me to help you pick out a new pen. You're here because you want to write a different ending. She leaned forward, the energy in the room shifting, sharpening. Mrs. Covington, most women in your position come in here, broken. They're shattered. They weep, they rage. They are drowning in the injustice of it all. They are, understandably, victims. You, she paused, studying me as if I were a complex legal text. You are not a victim. You are a soldier who has been holding a position for a very long time, and the enemy has just revealed his main force. You're angry, yes, but your anger is cold. It's the kind of anger that builds things or burns them to the ground. So tell me, Olivia, what do you want? She used my first name. It was a test, a sign of partnership, not pity. I want what I am owed, I said, my voice steady. 40 years is not an internship. A marriage is a partnership. His empire was built on the foundation of my life. I want my half of the stonework. Contingency, she said, not as an offer, but as a statement of fact. I'll take my fee from the final settlement, a significant percentage. Richard has an army of lawyers from Blackwood Finch. They will bury us in paperwork. They will delay. They will attack. They will try to bleed you dry emotionally and financially. They will paint you as a bitter, unstable, vindictive crone. They've already started, I said, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Good, Evelyn said, that sharp smile returning. Let them. It's a predictable strategy, and predictable men are easy to break. I'll take your case, Olivia. We'll file tomorrow morning. Let's give Richard something to read with his morning coffee besides the stock market report. As I walked out of her office and back into the anonymous city, I felt a shift in my own gravity. It was the first time in 40 years someone had looked at me and not seen an appendage of Richard Covington. They had seen a person, an equal, a soldier. The diary was still in my bag, its secret still mine alone, but it felt lighter now. It was no longer just the weight of my guilt. It was the weight of my ammunition, and I had just hired my general. The first volley in the war came not from a lawyer's office, but from the glowing screen of the burner phone Chloe had given me. It was a quiet afternoon. The house was a mausoleum of silence, each tick of the grandfather clock a reminder of the time I had lost. A notification buzzed, a message from Chloe. It wasn't words, just a link to Instagram, to Sarah's page. I tapped it, and my breath caught in my chest. There it was. A photo of our family, taken last Christmas. Richard with his arm around me, Jacob and Sarah beaming, the grandchildren on our laps in front of a ridiculously large tree. We looked like the perfect family, a snapshot of wealth and happiness. But it was the caption that was the weapon. Sarah had written, "Thinking of our family during this difficult time. My heart breaks for my wonderful mother-in-law, Olivia. We are praying for her peace and clarity. Sometimes life gets confusing as we get older, and it's our job to guide our elders with love and patience. Sending healing thoughts to everyone involved. #family first, #healing journey, #elder care, #love and patience." It was a masterpiece of passive aggression. A public performance of concern that was, in reality, a knife twisted with surgical precision. To her thousands of followers, she was the compassionate daughter-in-law, caring for her confused, unstable matriarch. I was no longer a person. I was a hashtag. #eldercare. A problem to be managed. A narrative to be controlled. I scrolled down. Jacob had shared it to his own Facebook page with the comment, "So proud of my wife's grace. We love my mother and only want what's best for her." The comments poured in. "So sorry you're going through this, Sarah. You're a saint. Sending prayers for your mother-in-law's stability. It's so hard when their minds start to go." The blood pounded in my ears. This was their strategy. Not just to take my money, but to take my identity. To erase the woman I was and replace her with a caricature. Frail, addled, incompetent. The kind of woman who couldn't possibly manage her own affairs. The kind of woman who needed a conservator. My first instinct was a hot, surging wave of rage. I wanted to comment, to scream the truth into this digital void, to expose their sanctimonious lies. But then, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Chloe. "Don't say a word," followed by another. "Screenshot everything, the post, the caption, every single comment, every share. Create a folder, label it digital defamation. This isn't a fight. This is evidence collection." Her instructions were a lifeline, pulling me back from the emotional precipice. She was right. Reacting was what they wanted. It would only feed their narrative of instability. Silence, on the other hand, was a void they couldn't control. So I sat there, in the quiet, cavernous living room that felt more like a crime scene with every passing day, and I began my work. I muted Sarah and Jacob on all platforms, but I didn't block them. I became a silent archivist of my own character assassination. Click, screenshot. The photo of us at the beach, captioned, "Remembering happier, clearer times." #memory lane, #mental health awareness. Click, screenshot. A picture of just Sarah and Jacob, looking solemn. Presenting a united front for the good of the whole family. It's what's most important. Click, screenshot. A comment from one of their friends. "I heard she had a breakdown at the party. So sad." Each screenshot was a small, cold act of rebellion. I was not screaming. I was not crying. I was building a case. With every saved image, I felt the hot, helpless anger cool into something harder, more useful. I was taking their poison and turning it into proof. They thought they were fighting a battle for public opinion on a field of their own choosing. They had no idea they were just handing me the blueprints to their own destruction. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a stone-faced courier who required a signature. The heavy cream envelope bore the insignia of Blackwood Finch. It felt cold to the touch. I knew, even before I opened it, that this was the next phase of their attack. Evelyn had warned me. Sarah's social media campaign wasn't just petty cruelty. It was groundwork. It was the soft propaganda that preceded the Blitzkrieg. Sitting at the massive dining table where I had hosted hundreds of dinners, I slit the envelope open with a letter opener, a wedding gift from decades ago. The words on the thick legal paper were dense and suffocating. A petition to the court. But it was the phrase in the second paragraph that sucked the air from my lungs. A petition for conservatorship over the person and estate of Olivia Covington, on the grounds of suspected age-related cognitive decline and an inability to manage her own financial and personal affairs. Cognitive decline. The words were a brand, searing into me. This was Richard's endgame. It wasn't enough to leave me. He had to erase me. He had to have me legally declared a non-person, an infant in the eyes of the law, with him or Jacob appointed as my keeper. The house, my money, my life. It would all be his to manage, while I was relegated to the status of a senile old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own checkbook. The smear campaign now made perfect, sickening sense. It was Exhibit A, in their case, against my sanity. The house suddenly felt immense, suffocating. The high ceilings seemed to press down on me, the silent, empty rooms echoing with their accusations. For a moment, a terrifying wave of despair washed over me. How could I fight this? How could I, a woman who hadn't balanced her own accounts in 40 years, stand against the legal might of Richard Covington? He had money, power, and now he had a medical narrative. He was trying to gaslight the legal system itself. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in my stomach. I retreated to the bedroom, the one room that still felt like a sanctuary, though even its familiarity was now tainted. I needed an anchor, something real to hold on to in this storm of lies. My eyes fell on the loose floorboard beneath the Persian rug. I knelt, my joints protesting, and pried it open. There it was, Arthur Vance's diary. The leather was worn, the pages brittle. I lifted it out, the weight of it both a burden and a comfort. This was more than an old book. It was the one truth left in a house built on lies. I had hidden it away 20 years ago out of fear. Fear of Richard, fear of what it meant, fear of upending the perfect life I thought I had. Now, that fear was gone, burned away by the fury of betrayal. I sat on the floor, the legal petition on one side, the diary on the other. I opened Arthur's journal and began to read, not with the frightened curiosity of my younger self, but with the focused intensity of a detective searching for a motive. The entries were a slow, painful descent. October 12, 2004. Richard presented my designs for the new cantilevered bridge to the board today. He called them our designs. When I questioned him later, he laughed, said I was being too sensitive, said we were a team, and he was just the face of it. He has a way of making you feel crazy for wanting credit for your own work. November 3, 2004. He lost the revised schematics I gave him. The ones with the updated safety calculations. Then, a week later, he presented a nearly identical set as his own, claiming he'd stayed up all night reworking the flaws. He looked me right in the eye as he said it. I felt my stomach drop. It's not just about credit anymore. It's theft. January 9th, 2005. I told him I was thinking of consulting a lawyer, just to formalize our partnership agreement. His smile disappeared. It was the first time I'd ever seen him without it. He told me that would be a very unwise decision. He said, "Think of your family, Arthur. Your lovely wife, your little girl. They're so happy here. It would be a shame if their world became complicated." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. He was talking about Amelia. I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking. He had threatened Arthur's family. He had threatened a child. The man I had shared a bed with for 40 years, the father of my son, was capable of this. The guilt was a physical blow. I had held this proof for 20 years. I had read these words and chosen to believe they were the ramblings of a troubled man. I had chosen my comfortable cage over Arthur's truth. If I had spoken up, would he still be alive? Would his daughter, Amelia, have her father? The guilt was a fire, but instead of consuming me, it forged something new inside me. The despair I felt just moments ago hardened into an unbreakable, diamond-sharp determination. This was no longer about my money or my pride. This was no longer about a divorce. This was about a man Richard had systematically destroyed. This was about a life I might have saved. I had been a silent accomplice for 2 decades. My silence ended now. Richard wanted to declare me incompetent. I would show him the work of a woman with nothing left to lose and a ghost to avenge. The key came, as it so often did, from Chloe, my digital ghost, my unseen ally. After I'd told her about the conservatorship petition, she went quiet for a full day. Then, a single, explosive text message landed on my burner phone. Amelia Vance, Richard's girlfriend. She's not just some young thing he picked up. She's an art historian, PhD from Yale. Her specialty is post-war German expressionism. She's giving a lecture at the Westmoreland Gallery on Saturday. I read the message 3 times. Amelia, Arthur Vance's daughter. It couldn't be a coincidence. The universe didn't bend in such perfect, terrible shapes by accident. She had gotten close to Richard. But why? For revenge? For answers? Or had she too fallen under his spell, unaware that he was the architect of her father's ruin? I didn't know, but I knew I had something she didn't, her father's words. A plan began to form, not a grand sweeping strategy, but a small, precise incision, a single targeted strike. I would not confront her. I would not reveal what I knew. I would simply plant a seed of doubt, watered by a detail so specific, so personal, it could only have come from one place. On Saturday, I stood before my wardrobe for the first time in weeks, not as Olivia Covington, the wife of a tycoon, but as an actress preparing for a role. Richard and Sarah wanted me to be frail, confused, heartbroken. I would give them the performance of a lifetime. I chose a beige cashmere sweater set, soft and unassuming. A string of pearls, classic and slightly old-fashioned. I stooped my shoulders slightly, practiced a faint tremor in my hand. I looked in the mirror and saw the woman from Sarah's Instagram post staring back at me. A harmless, slightly tragic old woman. Perfect. The Westmoreland Gallery was a quiet, sunlit space filled with people who spoke in hushed, reverent tones. Amelia stood near a large, turbulent painting, speaking to a small, enraptured audience. She was poised, intelligent, her passion for the subject evident in every gesture. She was her father's daughter. I felt a pang of something, regret, sorrow, kinship. I waited. I drifted through the other exhibits, feigning interest in sculptures and canvases, my heart pounding a steady, nervous rhythm. I was tracking her, waiting for the moment she was alone. It came when the lecture ended and the small crowd dispersed. She was standing by herself, looking at the painting she had just discussed, a small, pensive smile on her face. This was it. I took a deep breath and shuffled towards her, affecting a slightly unsteady gait. "Excuse me," I said, my voice soft, intentionally pitched to sound a little weak, a little lost. She turned, her professional smile clicking into place. "Yes? Can I help you?" "That painting," I said, gesturing vaguely towards the canvas of angry, jagged colors. "It's so much feeling." I let my eyes drift, as if searching for a thought. My late husband," I corrected myself with a sad little shake of my head. "My soon-to-be ex-husband, Richard. He was never one for this sort of thing. Too emotional. He always preferred things cleaner." Amelia's polite smile tightened. The name Richard hung in the air between us. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Richard Covington?" I nodded, looking down at my hands as if embarrassed. "Yes. Silly of me to bring it up. It's just all so fresh. I looked back at her, forcing a watery, fragile smile. You're the young woman he's with now, aren't you? Amelia, he's told me about you. He said you're very bright. Her posture stiffened. She was on guard, expecting an attack, a scene. I gave her the opposite. Oh, my dear, please don't look so worried, I said, patting her arm with my slightly trembling hand. I'm not here to cause a fuss. I'm just trying to understand it all. 40 years, you know. It's a long time. I looked back at the painting, then back at her, my expression one of genuine, befuddled reminiscence. It's funny. Seeing this painting reminds me of Richard's old partner, Arthur Vance. A dear, dear man. So sensitive. Richard used to say he was too sensitive for the business world. I saw a flicker in her eyes. The barest, quickest flash of something. Recognition. Pain. I pressed on, my voice a soft, meandering murmur. Arthur loved art like this. I remember one evening, he and Richard were arguing over some plans, and Arthur was so frustrated. He came over to me and pointed to a picture in a book we had. He said, "That, Olivia, that is how my soul feels today." It was that one. Oh, what was it called? The Shepherd, by Franz Marc. All those blue horses. He said he wished the world could be as peaceful and blue as that painting. I stopped. I had just quoted, almost verbatim, an entry from Arthur's diary. A private, anguished confession he had committed to paper 2 decades ago. It was a detail Richard would never know, would never remember, would never have cared about. It was a detail that could only have come from Arthur himself, or from someone who had read his most secret thoughts. I watched Amelia's face. The change was subtle, but to me, it was a seismic event. The professional poise crumbled, just for a second. The guarded look in her eyes was replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered confusion. Her brow furrowed. The name Franz Marc, the image of blue horses, it meant something to her. I could see the wheels turning, the question forming in her mind. How does this woman know that? I didn't wait for an answer. I had planted the seed. Now I had to walk away and let it grow in the dark. Well, I said with a sigh, pulling my cardigan tighter around myself. Listen to me, rambling on. Forgive an old woman her memories. It was lovely to meet you, my dear. I turned and walked away, not looking back. I didn't need to. I could feel her eyes on me, no longer seeing a frail, heartbroken victim, but an enigma, a puzzle she now had to solve. The tremor in my hands was gone. My shoulders were straight. As I pushed open the gallery's heavy glass door and stepped out into the cool afternoon air, I felt the unmistakable, unfamiliar sensation of control. The game had changed, and I had just moved my first pawn. The air in the mediation room was the color of old ice, and just as cold. It was a space designed to have no personality, no memory, just hard surfaces and the hushed, expensive hum of a hidden ventilation system. Across the vast, polished mahogany table, Richard sat flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they'd been assembled from a kit. Sharp suits, sharp haircuts, and identically predatory smiles. My son Jacob sat slightly behind his father, a portrait of filial duty, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just past my head. He couldn't look at me. He hadn't been able to look at me for weeks. On my side, there was only Evelyn Reed. Her calm was a fortress. She had placed her leather-bound portfolio on the table, but she hadn't opened it. Her hands rested on top of it, still and patient. She was watching, listening, absorbing the temperature of the room. I tried to do the same, but the delicate silk of my scarf felt unnaturally heavy against my collarbone. Hidden within its folds, smaller than a sugar cube, was a tiny microphone. My link to Chloe. My unseen weapon. I pictured her in her small student apartment, headphones on, a screen full of analytics in front of her, waiting. The thought was a small hot stone in the pit of my stomach. Richard's lead lawyer, a man named Sterling, with a voice as smooth and artificial as polished granite, began. "Olivia," he said, his tone dripping with a theatrical sort of pity, the kind reserved for difficult children or the mentally frail. We're here today to find an amicable path forward. Richard, as you know, has been more than generous in his desire to see you settled comfortably." I said nothing. My instructions from Evelyn were clear. Do not speak unless spoken to, and even then, let her answer first. My silence was a vacuum, and they rushed to fill it. "After careful consideration of your 40-year marriage," Sterling continued, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table, "and in light of, well, your current needs, Richard is prepared to offer you a one-time settlement." Evelyn didn't even need to pick it up. From where we sat, we could see the number. It was an insult. It was less than what Richard had spent on Amelia's car. It was the price of a nuisance, a fly to be swatted away. It was a figure designed not to settle, but to humiliate. To state, in black and white, exactly what I was worth to them after a lifetime of service. Evelyn leaned forward, a slow, deliberate movement. She didn't look at the paper. She looked directly at Sterling, then her gaze shifted to Richard. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the refrigerated air. "We reject your offer." That was it, the trigger. Richard, who had been sitting with an air of bored magnanimity, stiffened. A muscle in his jaw jumped. He had expected tears, a plea, a weary acceptance. He had not expected a flat, immediate rejection. "Reject it?" Richard's voice was a low growl. "On what grounds?" "She has no grounds. She has nothing." "My client has grounds of 40 years of marriage, of building a life and an empire with you, Richard," Evelyn stated calmly. "The offer is not a serious one, and you know it." Richard slammed his palm down on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Jacob flinched. The lawyers sat frozen, their professional masks slipping. "An empire?" Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She didn't build anything. She decorated houses. She planned parties. She was a passenger, a goddamn ornament I carried for 40 years, an ornament that's gotten old and cracked." I felt the words land, little darts of ice. I kept my face a perfect, placid blank. I could feel the microphone, a tiny point of warmth against my skin. "Are you getting this, Chloe? Is the audio clear?" "Richard, perhaps we should take a recess," Sterling suggested, his voice tight. But Richard was on his feet now, leaning over the table, his face mottled with rage. His control, always a thin veneer over a pit of fury, had shattered completely. This was the man I knew. This was the man I had lived with in silence. "No recess. She needs to hear this." "You," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think you're entitled to something? After what you've become. You wander around that big empty house talking to yourself. You can't remember what you had for breakfast. You're lost, Olivia. Delusional." He was spinning the narrative Sarah had so carefully crafted online. The frail, confused old woman, the tragic victim of cognitive decline. "I gave you everything," he spat, his voice rising in volume. "A beautiful home, a name, a son who is ashamed of you." Jacob visibly shrank at the mention of his name, his face pale. He still wouldn't look at me. He was staring at his hands, knotted in his lap. The shame was there, yes, but it wasn't for me. I saw it then. It was for himself. "And you think you can come in here with this ambulance chaser?" He gestured wildly at Evelyn. "And demand half of what I built, what I bled for, while you were picking out curtains. You're living in a fantasy world. You need help. You need to be looked after for your own good. That's all this is about. Your own protection." His tirade was a torrent of arias he'd been rehearsing in his own mind for years. Every resentment, every justification for his cruelty and his affairs, all of it came pouring out. He was performing, convinced of his own righteousness, certain of the audience in this room. He had no idea he was on a much, much bigger stage. I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips, but I pressed it down. I just looked at him, my expression one of mild, weary sadness. Let him see what he wanted to see. Let him think he was breaking me. Every word he spoke was another nail in his own coffin. "Richard, that is enough," Evelyn said, her voice like steel. She stood up, a calm, commanding presence against his chaotic rage. "This mediation is over. We will be in touch through official channels. She touched my elbow lightly. It was the signal. I rose slowly, my movements measured. I didn't look at Richard's contorted face or at my son's bowed head. I simply turned and walked with Evelyn toward the door. As we left, Richard was still shouting, his words echoing in the sterile hallway. "You'll get nothing. Do you hear me, Olivia? Nothing. You'll be penniless and alone." The heavy door clicked shut behind us, cutting off the sound. The silence in the elevator was profound. Evelyn didn't speak, just watched the numbers descend. I leaned my head back against the cool metal wall and closed my eyes, picturing a private Twitch channel, a small group of journalists leaning closer to their screens, their fingers flying across their keyboards. A case study in elder abuse. Chloe's framing was perfect. It wasn't just a marital dispute anymore. It was a story. Once we were in the sanctuary of her car, the city sliding by in a blur of gray and rain, Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was gentle. "Are you all right, Olivia?" I turned to look at her. Her face, usually a mask of professional composure, was filled with genuine concern. She saw me not as a case file, but as a woman who had just been savaged by the man she'd spent her life with. In that moment, the last wall of my own caution crumbled. She had passed my test. She had stood firm. She had seen his monstrousness and had not flinched. She had earned the truth. "I'm better than all right, Evelyn," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I'm ready. There's something you need to see." Back in her office, the air was warm, smelling of paper and faint, expensive perfume. It felt like a sanctuary after the Arctic chill of the mediation room. Evelyn poured me a glass of water, her movements efficient and kind. She sat opposite me, her expression patient, waiting. She thought I was going to break down, to finally let the tears come. Instead, I reached into my large handbag. My fingers brushed past my wallet, my reading glasses, and closed around the hard, unyielding shape of the book. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, a package with no return address. I placed it on the polished desk between us. The sound it made was soft, but it seemed to echo in the room. Evelyn looked at the package, then at me. A question formed in her eyes. "What's this, Olivia?" "This," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "is my leverage. It's why I was so sure he would break. It's everything." I unwrapped it slowly. The brown paper fell away to reveal the worn, dark green leather cover. It was warped from years of being hidden, the corners soft and frayed. There was no title, no markings of any kind. It looked ancient, forgotten. Evelyn stared at it. I could see the lawyer in her, cataloging, analyzing. She didn't reach for it. She waited for me. 20 years ago, I began, my voice finding its strength. Richard's business partner, Arthur Vance, died. It was ruled a suicide. He jumped from the George Washington Bridge. A week after the funeral, I was cleaning out some of Richard's old things from the attic, things he'd told me to throw away. I found this, tucked inside an old briefcase of Arthur's that Richard had brought home. I pushed the diary across the desk. I read a few pages, and I was so terrified by what I read that I hid it. I wrapped it in oilcloth and put it under a loose floorboard in my closet. I tried to forget it ever existed. For 20 years, I succeeded. Evelyn's eyes never left mine as I spoke. Then, she lowered her gaze to the diary. With a surgeon's precision, she pulled it closer and opened it to the first page. I watched her face as she began to read. It was like watching a landscape change under a passing storm. First, there was the focused concentration of a lawyer absorbing information. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned a page, then another. The narrative was dense, Arthur's handwriting a frantic, looping script. I knew the passages she was reading, the ones describing Richard's early manipulations, how he would subtly undermine Arthur in front of investors, dismiss his ideas as brilliant but impractical, then rebrand them as his own a week later. The gaslighting, the psychological warfare, it was all there, a blueprint for the man Richard would become. Evelyn's breathing changed. It became shallower. She turned another page. She was getting to the part about the patents, the intellectual property that had been the foundation of Richard's entire company. Arthur's detailed notes on how Richard had systematically forged documents, shifted assets, and locked him out of his own creations. Her expression shifted from focus to disbelief. A deep line appeared between her eyebrows. She pushed her glasses up her nose and leaned closer, as if the words might change if she looked at them harder. Then she reached the final entries, the entries from the last week of Arthur's life. The descriptions of Richard's threats, not veiled anymore, but open, brutal. Threats against Arthur's career, his family. The despair in the writing was a palpable thing, a stain on the yellowed paper. Evelyn's hand, the one not holding the page, went to her mouth. Her knuckles were white. Her professional composure had evaporated, replaced by raw, unfiltered shock. She read the last entry, the one written the night before Arthur died. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a promise to fight, a desperate final vow to expose Richard. She finally looked up from the diary. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time since I'd met her, Evelyn Reed looked truly stunned. She stared at me, and in her gaze, I was no longer just a wronged wife in a messy divorce. I was the keeper of a 20-year-old crime scene. "Olivia," she breathed, the word barely audible. "My God, this isn't a divorce case." "No," I said softly. "It never was. This is wrongful death." "This is massive systemic fraud. The statute of limitations on fraud might be an issue, but the pattern of behavior, the threats..." She trailed off, her legal mind racing, connecting dots I couldn't even see. "He didn't just steal a company, Olivia. He stole a man's life." She stood up and began to pace the length of her office, a caged tiger of righteous energy. She ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair, messing it up. She was no longer just my lawyer. She was a woman on the hunt. "We have to change everything," she said, thinking out loud. "The mediation, Richard's little tantrum, that was just the appetizer. This diary is the main course. But we can't just drop it on them. Not yet. He'll destroy it, deny it, bury us in legal challenges." She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes blazing with a fierce, brilliant light. "We use the divorce as a smokescreen. We proceed as if we're just fighting over the house and the bank accounts. We let him think he's winning, that he's grinding you down. Meanwhile, we use this." She tapped the diary with a long, elegant finger. "We hire private investigators, forensic accountants. We find the money, Olivia. The money he stole from Arthur. If he was this meticulous in his cruelty, he was just as meticulous in his greed. The evidence has to be somewhere." A new plan began to form in the space between us, a complex and dangerous piece of architecture. It was no longer about getting my fair share. It was about dismantling Richard's entire world, brick by stolen brick. It was about justice for a ghost, a man whose desperate words I had hidden away for 2 decades. The fear I felt was different now. It was no longer the gnawing, passive fear of a victim. It was the sharp, electric fear of a hunter closing in on her prey. I had carried this burden alone for so long. Now I had an ally, a powerful one. "The plan," Evelyn said, her voice low and intense, "is no longer to win you a house. The plan is to burn his kingdom to the ground." The weeks that followed were a quiet, humming beehive of activity. While Evelyn's team worked in the shadows, digging into 20-year-old financial records and corporate filings, my job was to set the stage for the final act. I sent the invitations. 3 of them were on my finest cream-colored stationery, the kind I used for Christmas cards and condolences. Formal, embossed invitations to Richard, Jacob, and Sarah. "I would like to finalize our discussions at the house next Tuesday at 3 p.m. I am ready to sign the agreement." They would read weakness in those words. Surrender. They would see a lonely old woman in a big house, finally broken, ready to accept the scraps they had offered. They would come smelling blood in the water, smug and victorious. The 4th invitation was different. It was a simple, handwritten note on a plain white card. I sent it to the gallery where I knew Amelia often spent her afternoons. I didn't know her address, but I knew her habits. Richard was a creature of routine, and he had imposed his routines on her. The note said only, "Amelia, we need to discuss the painting. The One of the Sea. Tuesday, 3 p.m. My home. It was a gamble. A breadcrumb from the diary. In one of his most tormented entries, Arthur had written about a small painting of a stormy sea that he had given to a 5-year-old Amelia for her birthday. It was the last gift he ever gave her. He wrote that Richard had mocked it, called it a worthless little daub. It was a detail only Amelia would understand. A key designed for a single lock. I didn't know if she would come or what she would do if she did. She was the wild card, the ghost at the feast. On Tuesday, the house was silent. I had dismissed the housekeeper for the day. I moved through the rooms, a stranger in my own life. Every object held a memory, a layer of history I was about to detonate. The grand piano Richard never played. The family portraits where we all smiled like strangers. The air was thick with unspoken words, with 40 years of compromise and quiet desperation. They arrived precisely at 3, just as I knew they would. Richard first, his face a mask of condescending triumph. Jacob and Sarah trailed behind him like acolytes. Sarah already had her phone out, no doubt ready to document my final capitulation for her online audience. "Mother," Jacob said, his voice strained. "We're glad you've decided to be reasonable." "It's for the best, Olivia," Richard added, already striding into the living room as if he still owned it. "No more drama, just a clean break." I just nodded, my heart a steady, cold drum against my ribs. I led them into the living room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the real churning sea. The light was gray and flat, the sky the color of slate. I indicated the sofa and armchairs arranged around the large mahogany coffee table. They sat, a tribunal ready to pass sentence. Richard's lawyer, Sterling, was with them, a briefcase full of papers on his lap, ready for my signature. Just as Sterling was about to speak, the doorbell rang again. Richard frowned. "Are you expecting someone else?" "Yes," I said calmly. "I am." I went to the door and opened it. Amelia stood there, looking uncertain. She was dressed in a chic, expensive-looking coat, but her face was pale and her eyes were full of questions. She saw Richard and his family in the living room, and her confusion deepened. "Olivia, your note," she began. "Please come in, Amelia," I said, my voice gentle. "This concerns you too." She stepped inside hesitantly, her gaze flicking from me to a furious-looking Richard. He was on his feet, his face darkening. "What is she doing here, Olivia? What is this?" "Sit down, Richard," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a new weight to it, a finality. To my surprise, he hesitated, then slowly sat. Everyone was looking at me now. The air in the room was electric, a gathering storm. Sterling cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Mrs. Thorne, we have the documents here." He gestured with a gold pen. "If you would just sign—" I looked at the pen, then at him. I let the silence stretch, filling every corner of the room. I walked over to the coffee table, but I didn't take the pen. Instead, I reached down and picked up the object I had placed there moments before they arrived. It was the copy of Arthur Vance's diary. I held it in my hands. It felt as heavy as a gravestone. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice resonating in the dead quiet, "but I would like to read something." Richard's face, which had been a mask of smug impatience, began to change. A flicker of something dark and ancient passed through his eyes, a recognition. I opened the book to a page I had marked. This was written by Arthur Vance, the night before he died. "What is this nonsense?" Richard barked, half rising from his chair. "Olivia, you're unwell. This is proof of what I've been saying." "He was here again tonight." I began to read, my voice clear and unwavering, ignoring him completely. He didn't even pretend this time. He told me if I went to the authorities, if I tried to expose what he'd done with the patents, he would destroy me, not just the business, me. He said he would paint me as an unstable, bankrupt failure. He said he would tell my wife things, lies, that would make her leave me. He said he would make sure Amelia grew up thinking her father was a coward and a fraud. He looked me in the eye and he said, "Some people just aren't strong enough for this world, Arthur. Sometimes they just fall." It wasn't advice. It was a promise. I stopped reading and looked up. The room was frozen. Jacob and Sarah were staring, mouths agape, utterly lost. Sterling looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. And Richard's face was a canvas of pure fury and panic. He lunged, his hand reaching across the table to snatch the diary from my grasp. "Give me that!" he roared. I didn't flinch. I held it just out of his reach, my calm a wall he couldn't breach. "It's a copy, Richard," I said, my voice as cold and calm as the sea outside. "The original is safe." As Richard's scream of denial tore through the living room, a strangled gasp came from near the door. Every head turned. Amelia stood as if rooted to the floor, her face the color of chalk. Her knuckles were pressed against her lips, her eyes wide with a dawning, unbearable horror. The cryptic note about a painting, the scene unfolding before her, the words I had just read. The pieces were clicking into place with the sickening finality of a lock snapping shut. "My father," she whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the ringing silence that followed Richard's outburst. "My father wrote that, in his journal." Richard froze, his hand still outstretched, his face contorting from rage to disbelief. He stared at Amelia as if seeing her for the first time. The beautiful, pliant young woman he had chosen as his trophy was suddenly a specter from the past he had buried 2 decades ago. Her own long con, a fragile, desperate attempt to get close to the man she suspected had destroyed her family, was unraveling right in front of him. I am Amelia Vance," she confessed, her voice trembling but gaining strength with each word. "Arthur Vance was my father. I've been trying to find out what happened to him for years. I needed to get close to you. I needed to find the proof." Richard staggered back as if she had physically struck him, collapsing into his armchair. "Vance," he breathed, the name a curse on his lips. Jacob and Sarah looked back and forth between Richard and Amelia, their smug expressions replaced by panic and confusion. The solid ground of their inheritance was turning to quicksand beneath their feet. But the chaos of Amelia's confession was only a distraction. It was the emotional tremor before the earthquake. I had let the personal drama play out, a bitter appetizer for the main course. Now, it was time for the checkmate. "The truth is all here, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the rising panic. I calmly turned the pages of the diary copy, my movements deliberate. I didn't stop at a page of text. I stopped at a page that looked like a simple accounting ledger, a dry list of figures Arthur had been working on. It was a page Richard would have glanced at and dismissed as meaningless. "Arthur was meticulous," I explained to the silent room. "He knew you might find his journal one day, so he hid the most important thing in plain sight. He disguised it." I held up the book so they could all see the column of numbers. "This isn't a ledger. It's a code. Evelyn's investigators broke it last week. It's a routing number and an account number." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. For an untraceable bank in the Cayman Islands. The account was opened 20 years ago, the day after the patents for Arthur's work were officially transferred into your name alone. I lowered the book and looked directly at Richard. His face had gone from red to a waxy, bloodless white. "It's the account where you first deposited the money from the technology you stole from him." "And the most beautiful part, Richard? The part that ends everything for you?" I leaned forward slightly. "We know the account is still active. You're still using it, funneling money through it from your shell corporations. It's not just proof of a 20-year-old fraud. It's proof of active, ongoing money laundering. It's irrefutable. It's career-ending. It's prison." I finished speaking. The only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of my husband. He stared at the page, at the numbers that had just become the bars of his cage. He had been so careful, so clever, but he had underestimated the 2 people he had destroyed. A dead man who had left behind a map, and a quiet woman who had finally learned how to read it. Then, a new sound punctuated the suffocating silence, clear, sharp, and final. The chime of the doorbell. Everyone flinched, except for me. I didn't need to look at the door. I knew who was standing on the other side. Evelyn's timing, like her legal strategy, was impeccable. As the second chime rang, I looked at my son, Jacob, at his wife, Sarah, at the man I had given my life to. I saw not a family, but a house of cards, trembling in the wind, about to be swept away forever. And for the first time in 40 years, I felt the air in my own home become breathable. I felt free. The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It ended with the cold, metallic click of handcuffs. One pair for Richard, whose face had collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The arrogance, the smug certainty that had defined him for 40 years, evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a hollowed-out old man staring at his own ruin. Another pair for Jacob, my son. He didn't look at his father. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to swallow the very light in the room. It was the look of a child who had just realized the monster under the bed was real and that he had been feeding it all along. He opened his mouth, my name forming on his lips, a silent, desperate plea. I held his gaze for a fraction of a second, long enough for him to see there was nothing left there for him, no lifeline, no soft place to land. Then I turned away. Sarah was a different kind of spectacle. Her panic was shrill, digital. Her first instinct, her only instinct, was to raise her phone, her thumb already jabbing at the screen to go live, to frame this as some kind of horrible mistake, an attack on their family. A policewoman, calm and unfazed, gently put a hand over the phone's camera. "Ma'am, you're going to need to put that away. You are being detained as a material witness and a person of interest in an ongoing financial investigation." The word detained shattered Sarah's composure. A raw, guttural sob escaped her lips, the sound of a carefully constructed reality imploding. Evelyn was at my side, a firm hand on my elbow. Chloe was on my other, a silent, solid shield. They moved me through the chaos as if parting a sea. The flashing blue and red lights painted the damask wallpaper in frantic, strobing patterns of judgment. Outside, the night had erupted. It wasn't just a few reporters Chloe had tipped off. It was a swarm. The sound was overwhelming, a cacophony of shouted questions and the percussive, insect-like clicking of 100 cameras, all firing at once, capturing the fall of the House of Sterling. "Mrs. Sterling, is it true? What do you know about Arthur Vance?" Richard, look over here." I didn't flinch. I felt strangely distant from it all, as if I were watching a film of someone else's life. The woman being escorted to a waiting car wasn't me. She was a character who had finally reached the end of her story arcs. Evelyn opened the car door, and I slid in, Chloe following right behind me. Evelyn spoke to the driver, and we pulled away from the curb, leaving the flashing lights and the collapsing world behind us. The next few days were a blur of legalities. I sat in Evelyn's sterile, glass-walled office, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, as she laid out the new reality. Richard's charges were staggering. Fraud on a scale that spanned 2 decades, money laundering through a complex web of offshore accounts, the very ones Amelia's father had documented. And then, the gravest of all, the district attorney's office was officially reopening the investigation into the death of Arthur Vance, not as a suicide, but as a homicide. "They have the diary, Olivia," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm. "They have Amelia's testimony about how her father was being threatened and psychologically tormented, and they have the financial trail." It's a powerful case. Jacob and Sarah were arrested the following morning. It turned out that in his desperation to hide assets before the divorce, Richard had made several large, clumsy transfers into accounts controlled by his son and daughter-in-law. They were accessories. Their names, once plastered across society pages, were now in headlines of a very different sort. Chloe showed me one on her tablet, a cruel but fitting epitaph from a popular online gossip site. From Park Avenue princess to potential prison mate, the fall of Sarah Sterling. The article was accompanied by a picture of Sarah, weeping, being led from her townhouse. Her perfectly curated world of sponsored posts and performative happiness had been reduced to a viral meme. I felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't pity. It was the cold, clean feeling of a fever finally breaking. The news cycle was brutal and relentless. Decades of Richard's carefully crafted philanthropy and business acumen were dismantled overnight. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a ghoul, a man who had built an empire on the bones of his friend. The company's stock plummeted. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting and ousted him in absentia. It was a complete and total annihilation. In the quiet of my house now, in a way it had never been before, the silence was deafening. The place was a mausoleum of a life I no longer recognized. Every painting, every piece of furniture, felt tainted by the lie it had upheld. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own home, the echoes of the recent chaos still ringing in my ears. Jacob was out on bail, awaiting his own trial. His lawyer had called Evelyn, attempting to arrange a meeting with me to appeal to a mother's love. I refused. There was one last thing I had to do. One final tie to sever. I went to the antique writing desk in the study, the one Richard had bought at an auction in France. For years, I had sat there writing invitations, thank you notes, Christmas cards, all the small, mundane tasks of a corporate wife. The stationery was thick and creamy, embossed with the family crest Richard had designed himself. I took out a single sheet and a heavy black fountain pen. My hand was steady as I began to write. My dearest Jacob, the words flowed, not from a place of anger, but from a well of grief so deep I thought it might drown me. I am writing this letter, not to the man who stood by his father as he tried to destroy me, but to the little boy I remember. The boy with scraped knees who believed his mother could fix anything with a kiss and a bandage. I remember the day you learned to ride your bicycle without training wheels in the park. You were so terrified of falling, but so determined to fly. When you finally pedaled away on your own, you looked back at me, your face alight with a joy so pure it felt like sunshine. Where did that boy go, Jacob? Tears I didn't know I had left began to fall, splattering onto the expensive paper, blurring the ink. I didn't wipe them away. I let them become part of the message. I have mourned you for years, my son. I mourned you every time you chose his approval over your own conscience. I mourned you when you looked at me with his cold, dismissive eyes. I saw you shrinking in his shadow, twisting yourself into a shape that pleased him, and I did nothing. My silence was my failure. I thought I was keeping the peace, protecting the family, but I was just tending to the bars of my own cage, and yours. I see that now. I see that my greatest mistake was not in what Richard did, but in what I allowed. I allowed his darkness to dim your light, and for that, I will be forever sorry. I paused, my hand aching. The weight of the pen felt immense, the weight of every unspoken word for the past 40 years. I remembered his face in the living room, just days ago, his voice laced with contempt as he urged me to take Richard's insulting offer. He had called me weak, naive. He had chosen a percentage of a tainted fortune over his own mother. The memory gave me the strength to write the final necessary words. The legal proceedings will run their course. You will face the consequences of your choices, just as your father will. But my judgment is a separate matter. It is not about punishment. It is about preservation. I must save what is left of myself. I cannot be part of your life moving forward. I cannot be the mother you run to when this is all over, because the woman you knew, the woman who would have forgiven anything, no longer exists. She died in that living room on my 40th anniversary. Therefore, I am formally disinheriting you. Everything that is mine will one day go to supporting the very kind of women your father preyed upon. This is not an act of vengeance. It is an act of release. I am releasing you from the pretense of being a loving son, and I am releasing myself from the obligation of being a forgiving mother. It is the most painful and the most honest thing I have ever done. I hope one day in the quiet of your own heart you find that little boy on the bicycle again. I hope you can save him. I, sadly, cannot. Goodbye, Jacob. I signed my name, Olivia Sterling, for the last time. I folded the letter, slid it into a matching envelope, and sealed it with a steady hand. It felt less like mailing a letter and more like closing a tomb. I didn't call a messenger. I walked to the postbox at the end of the long driveway myself, the crisp autumn air feeling clean against my skin. I slid the letter into the slot. The metallic clang echoed in the silence. It was done. I had finally amputated the gangrenous limb to save the body. I turned back to the house, and for the first time, it didn't look like a prison. It looked like an asset waiting to be liquidated. The seasons turned. The brutal media frenzy faded into the background hum of the next scandal. The legal gears ground on, slow and inexorable. And in the backyard of the house on the coast, something new began to grow. 6 months had passed since the night the world fell apart. The house, once a symbol of my gilded cage, was now filled with a different kind of light. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, no longer illuminating dust motes of sorrow, but rather the stark, clean emptiness of rooms being prepared for a new owner. The sale was closing next week, not because I had to sell, but because I wanted to. The house held no power over me anymore. I was in the garden. For years, it had been a neglected patch of land, tended to by a hired service that kept it neat but lifeless. Now, it was a riot of color and life, a chaotic, beautiful testament to hard work. My hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused and stained with rich soil. I had spent months out here, on my knees, pulling out the stubborn, deep-rooted weeds of the past. I had tilled the compacted earth, breathing life back into it, just as I was breathing life back into myself. "You're going to over-prune those roses if you're not careful," a cheerful voice called out. I looked up, smiling. Chloe was walking across the lawn, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea. She had just finished her first year of law school, her grades putting her at the top of her class. The case, she'd told me, had ignited something in her. She no longer saw the law as an abstract collection of rules, but as a sword and a shield. "They need a firm hand," I replied, snipping a dead rose head with a satisfying crunch. "A bit of tough love to encourage new growth." She laughed, settling the tray on a small iron table. "Sounds familiar?" We sat there for a while, sipping our tea, the salty air from the sea mixing with the sweet scent of the blooming jasmine I had planted. We didn't need to talk much. We had forged a new kind of family in the crucible of the last year, one built not on obligation or blood, but on mutual respect and genuine affection. "Evelyn called," Chloe said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "The paperwork for the foundation is finalized. We're officially the Vance Reed Foundation." A wave of profound satisfaction washed over me. With the proceeds from the house sale and the assets Evelyn's team had managed to seize from Richard's collapsing empire, money that had been clawed back from the brink of his fraudulent abyss, we were creating something meaningful. A charity, co-chaired by Evelyn and Amelia Vance, dedicated to providing the very thing I never had, a lifeline. It would offer legal and financial support to women trying to escape psychologically abusive relationships. It would give them the tools to fight back, a safe harbor in their own personal storms. I had met with Amelia a few weeks ago. The anger that had fueled her for so long had softened into a quiet, determined peace. She was working to get her father's name and legacy restored, not as a victim, but as the brilliant innovator he was. The foundation, she said, was the most fitting tribute she could imagine. It was turning their shared pain into a source of power for others. "What about him?" Chloe asked gently, her voice losing its lightness. She didn't need to say the name. Richard's trial was set to begin in the fall. Jacob had taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against his father in exchange for a reduced sentence. The ultimate betrayal, Richard had apparently screamed in a preliminary hearing. The irony was lost on him. "I don't think about him," I said, and the most surprising thing was that it was true. He had become a stranger, a character in a story I had finished reading. The pain was still there, a faint scar on my soul, but it no longer defined me. It was just a part of my history, not my identity. Chloe nodded, understanding. "Good. You have better things to grow." She gestured to the garden around us. I looked at my creation. The determined sunflowers standing tall against the fence. The resilient lavender thriving in the sandy soil. The delicate but tenacious roses, their thorns a promise of their strength. Each one was a victory. Each one was a choice I had made. After Chloe left, I remained in the garden as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The house behind me was just a structure of wood and glass, soon to be someone else's home, someone else's story. My home was no longer a place. It was a feeling. It was this moment, right here. The feeling of the cool breeze on my skin, the smell of the earth on my hands, the quiet hum of a world I was building for myself, one seed at a time. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I was no longer a prisoner in a gilded cage. I was simply, finally, wonderfully free. I took a deep breath, and the air, for the first time in 40 years, felt like it was truly my own. What's the one thing you've done to reclaim your own story? Share your moment of freedom in the comments below. Your strength might be the seed someone else needs to plant their own garden.